Okay, welcome back. Yeah, it's been a week. Yeah. Yeah. Just want to remind everybody that we're doing the Frederick Douglass for next time, right? We're doing the excerpt from his autobiography, Learning to Read, and just remember to submit at least 3 words you had to look up to the vocab folder. Now, I know that a couple of you are already at 10 out of 10 points, so you don't necessarily need to keep submitting to the vocab folder once you are at 10 points, right? But you'll get more participation points if you do, right? You can't earn more than 10 points on the vocab assignment itself, though. So I'm glad you're still looking things up. That's good habit, right? And also remember to complete Exploratory Reflection 2 for Thursday, and you can use either the Confucius, the Gandhi, the Bentham, or the Ursula Le Guin as your subject for that. And otherwise, you are doing the same thing that you did for Exploratory Reflection 1, right? This is to build a possible research paper out of for assignment 2, right?
So we would use our exploratory reflection like how we did last time, our exploratory reflection.
Yeah, that could then be the basis for a bigger research paper.
Okay.
Yeah, because So, we're going to do a third exploratory reflection as well. So if you decide that you'd rather use that as the basis for your research paper, that's fine too. But think about this in terms of just doing some groundwork for a bigger paper, right? Does anybody have any other questions about assignments or anything that's coming up in the future?
What's our research paper going to be on?
Well, it's going to be on one of the texts that we've looked at either in this justice unit or in the next unit. So essentially, you're going to be writing about a piece of text.
Okay, so it's basically like the same paper in a sense?
Yeah, it's going to be similar to what you did for paper 1, but paper 1 was all out of your own head, right? Paper 2 is going to be a little longer, and you're going to incorporate research. So we are going to spend a day working with the library resources to show you how to find things, and how to get sources for your paper. And we will also do another writing day in class. So, any other questions? I'll give you the assignment for paper 2, by the way, next week, so that we know what this is going to look like. We have time to prepare for it. All right. So, what we're going to be talking about today is a system of thought called utilitarianism and its relationship to morality and ethics. And I wanted to start with this quote from a 19th century Russian novel, The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky, because it relates directly to some of the topics we're going to be discussing, right? So to give you some context for this quote, which I hope you have had a chance to read since you came in and sat down, this is occurring in a conversation between 2 of the brothers. The speaker, Ivan, is a brilliant but chronically depressed philosopher who is also an atheist. The person listening is his brother Alexei, who is a novice priest. And so what Ivan is questioning Alexei on is the justice of certain Christian theological beliefs. But I think what I want to expand this out into is discussion of morality and ethics more generally. The reason I choose this quote, by the way, is because it is, in some ways, the starting point for Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, right? It was what gave her the central image. So let's just pick this quote apart for a minute, and then we will dig into the text for the day, right? So Imagine that you are creating a fabric of human destiny with the object of making men happy in the end, giving them peace and rest at last, but that it was essential and inevitable to torture to death only one tiny creature, that baby beating its breast with its fist, for instance, and to found that edifice on its unavenged tears. Would you consent to be the architect on those conditions? Tell me, and tell the truth. So what is the question that Ivan is asking his brother Alexei here? If we had to boil this down, what does this mean?
He's asking him if he would be willing to put that one baby through that in order to make this perfect, like, happy society, if he would be one, if he would do that given the circumstances.
Yeah. If all you had...
Basically questioning his morality.
Yeah. If all you had to do was set up a system of perfect happiness for everyone, was take one small, insignificant creature and cause it horrendous pain, right? Would you still do it? And I think it's important here, he says, to found that edifice on its unavenged tears.
What is edifice?
Yeah, I was about to ask.
Okay, so an edifice is a building, right? So he's using an architectural metaphor here. To found that edifice, or to make the foundation of your building the unavenged tears of this, say, this child, right? Would you consent to be the architect, right? Would you design that building if these were the conditions? And why is it important here that tears have to be unavenged? What does that mean? Well, they actually are there for a reason, right? The unavenged tears are what...
Right. I'm just trying to think of unavenged. My head went straight to the Avengers.
Well, I mean, we might even kind of think about that. Like, we can actually even kind of use the example of Thanos here, right?
Yeah.
What is Thanos' goal in those Avengers movies?
To bring balance to the universe
Yeah, he believes the universe to be overpopulated, right?
by wiping out half of it.
Yeah, and we can create ecological balance and perfect happiness for the survivors, right? If we wipe out arbitrarily half of the people who live in this universe, right? This is actually a classic example of utilitarian reasoning. Taken to its extreme, right? But the reason why the tears have to be unavenged, right? The idea here is, the thing that Ivan is telling Alexei is, you cannot apologize or make amends for this, right?
Oh, right, like the
Yeah. You can't do anything to mitigate this,
You
right?
can't take it back, is basically what
Yeah.
you're saying.
You can't get, not only can you not take it back, right, you can't even apologize, right? You can't do anything to lessen the impact of the suffering here, right? You just have to let it happen in order to build a perfect world for everybody else. And of course, what Ivan is arguing is that the basic system of Christian religion in which people suffer in this world in order to have a better afterlife works essentially this way, right? So Ivan is leveling this accusation at God and is trying to convince his brother, the priest, of the wrongness of his position, right? But the reason I quote this here is, again, because of its direct relationship to Le Guin's text, and also because it does have bearing on what Bentham is doing as well. So let's take a quick, let's go back first to the Jeremy Bentham essay, damn it, which is first published in 1780. So what were you guys able to get from the Bentham essay? What were your takeaways from this? What is his argument, as near as you can figure?
first
Yeah, it's the principle of utility.
Just reading about him, he seems very modern, like before his time.
Okay. What about him seems modern?
Like some of the things that he's like an advocate for.
Yeah.
The vocal opponent of slavery, in support of full equality for women.
Uh-huh.
The decriminalization of homosexuality, the separation of church and state, and the ethical treatment of animals. It's like it's on the forefront now.
Yeah. Particularly as a person of his time, Bentham would have been a progressive. And one of the mildly terrifying elements of Bentham's thought, at least for me as a person who is someone of progressive politics, right, is that a lot of his suggestions about how society should be ordered are intended to make it, as he sees it, more progressive, right? So Bentham is the father of a school of philosophy called utilitarianism. Right? A word that we have just tossed around quite a bit here, but let's talk a little bit about what it means, right? What word do you recognize in utilitarian? Utility is the root word, yeah. And what does utility mean?
Maybe like essentials, because whenever I think of utilities, I think of like utility bills like water, gas, and stuff like that.
Okay, so so utilities are, in this case, like services that are provided by the city, right?
Yeah.
But that's not quite the kind of, it's related, but it's not quite the kind of utility we're talking about, right? What you might want to think about that in terms of we pay those bills because those things are useful, right?
I said resources.
Yeah. They are resources, right? But a utility is essentially, something useful, right? Yeah, utility is something that's defined by its use, right? And so utilitarianism argues that all ideas should be judged on the basis of usefulness. But the utilitarian definition of usefulness is highly specific. Bentham's key insight is that all human behavior is motivated by two impulses. The first is desire for reward. And the second is fear of punishment. And he first brings these ideas to bear on reform of the prison system.
What did you write before behavior?
Human. Human behavior motivated by two impulses.
Okay.
So the way British prisons typically looked in the 18th century, right? They had a design that had been motivated by certain religious reformers, right? They argued that if you put people in a dark room by themselves with a Bible, right, having no other recourse, they would turn to the good book to reform their behavior. Now, how often do you think that actually happened? Pretty much never, right? Because what actually happens to people when you put them alone in dark rooms?
They get afraid.
Yes. So this system that was intended to reform the behavior of prisoners was actually just making people nuts, right? So Bentham designed a model prison based on these principles that he called a panopticon. Pan, all, optic, seeing, right? So it's, the basic idea is you've got a central tower in which a guard may or may not be sitting, and the guard from the central tower can see into all of the cells. So let's just make sure there's a little guy in each of these. Because prison overcrowding was a problem then too. So why have I made all of these arrows from the central tower one directional? What does that tell us about how this prison was set up?
They can't see him, but he can see them.
Exactly.
Do they got a two-way mirror?
Pardon?
Do they have like a two-way mirror or something?
Well, no, it's not a two-way mirror. It's actually set up like much more simply than that. But yeah, the basic point is that the prisoners know that they might be observed at any time, right? But they can't see whether the guard is observing them or not. The basic idea here being is that they will reform their behavior to avoid punishment because they know they might be watched all the time. Right? So motivation by fear of punishment here to reform behavior. And then also, hope of reward, maybe early release for good behavior, right? But what Bentham is banking on is that people being watched all the time will lead to a better social outcome, right? Because this is all people really want. And he deduces these ideas from thinking about both religion and law, right? He decides that religion is motivated primarily by this first impulse, right? That we follow particular sets of rules belonging to our particular religion because we hope to get into the good afterlife, not the bad afterlife. So we're hoping for some reward at the end of all this. Meanwhile, we obey the law of our particular nation or locality, mostly because we're afraid of being punished, right? We don't want to go to jail, we don't want to be put in the stocks, we don't want to be hanged, right? Now, all of this is occurring in an intellectual context that historians call the Enlightenment. Are any of you guys familiar with the concept of the Enlightenment in the 18th century? Like what this was, what this means?
I remember like learning about it.
Okay. So what vague memories do you guys have of this? So what do you remember about it?
I feel like it has something to do with religion, like with Christianity, like people going from like the Catholic Church and making their own religion.
Okay, I think you're thinking of the Protestant Reformation, which occurs a bit earlier in the 15th century, or starts in the 15th century. But yeah, you're thinking along the right lines. It's a similar kind of movement.
Is John Rousseau, is he the Enlightenment thinker?
Yes.
Right, that's the only person I can
Okay, yeah. Rousseau is regarded as an Enlightenment thinker, yeah.
I remember talking about him in high school. Don't remember what he said.
Yeah, like last time I heard about this was in like 11th grade, and I
I'm
was
world
like,
history right now, and I already forgot.
Okay.
I love that.
All right. So the basic idea behind Enlightenment philosophy, right? It was kind of like a philosophical movement in the broad sense, right? Like it's not just it's it's not just a revolution of what we would call philosophy, but in thought generally, right? It's a kind of different way of looking at the world. The basic idea of enlightenment is the banishment of superstition. And irrationality.
So I guess this is way after the Salem witch trials.
This would be mostly post-Salem witchcraft trials,
Okay.
yes.
Yes,
Although I think another thing that we have to remember too is that like movements in elite society tend to take a while to trickle down, right? So while, Enlightenment philosophy was a big deal with the educated classes in the 18th century, ordinary people still went on believing often as they always had, like maybe with some minor modifications here and there, right? For example, the way people used to do science before the Enlightenment was based on a system of correspondences, right? That is similarities and dissimilarities. So, if you were stricken with a blood disease in, say, the 15th century, your doctor might prescribe to you a concoction of powdered ruby dissolved in a cup of red wine. Why? What's the logic?
Wait, what is it?
Yes, because they're all red, right? Red blood, red things fixing your red blood, right? And because the zodiac sign associated with the color red is Aries, if you drank this concoction when the sun is in Aries, it would be more potent, right? So this all sounds really illogical and irrational to us, right? It sounds more like magic than like science. But this was how science had been done for centuries prior to the scientific method, right? And to the people who practiced this, it made perfect logical sense, right? Like, of course, because your blood is red, you want to fix it with red things, right? Of course. What's that?
That's that poor thing.
Yeah.
Bless their heart.
But they would find our obsession with testing our observations, to get at theories, right, irrational, right? It was just a completely different paradigm of thought. But the Enlightenment is what shook up this older paradigm of thought and replaced it with more scientific ways of thinking, right? Or what we would regard as more scientific ways of thinking, with more modern scientific ways of thinking. So, what is the scientific method? How does this work?
Yeah, you create a theory, or a,
Yeah, a theory is actually what you're working towards, right?
What's it called? Hypothesis?
Yeah.
That's the word.
Yes, you observe something in nature, right? You develop a hypothesis about why this is, and design a test, or design an experiment in order to test that hypothesis. And then you just test the shit out of that hypothesis, right? Until you're pretty sure that this is the way things work. And when your hypothesis has been thoroughly tested, that's when you have a theory, right? So, and I think a lot of people get confused about the way we use the word theory, right? Because in common conversation, a theory is something that's unproven, right? Whereas in the sciences, a theory is something that has actually been pretty thoroughly tested and we're pretty sure is the way things are, right? Now, a law is like one of those kind of foundational principles that, yes, we know this is how this works, absolutely, and everything else falls apart if this no longer is the case, right? So something like gravity, right? But the point I'm trying to make here, right, is that much philosophy in the Enlightenment is as motivated by scientific reasoning as actual science was, right? So Bentham is trying to come up with a kind of scientific system for ordering society in order to achieve maximum human happiness, right? And in fact, like, he tends to think about human happiness in vaguely mathematical terms. He came up with a concept that he called the Hedonic Calculus. And this was an equation that was designed to measure precisely the amount by which any given action would either increase pleasure or reduce pain. And that's the basic goal of any good action or good law for Bentham, right? That which is right for him is that which increases pleasure or reduces pain. That which is wrong is that which decreases pleasure or increases pain. And does he seem to make any real distinction between increasing pleasure and reducing pain? Yeah, he uses the phrase what comes to the same thing a lot, right? You know, when he says increasing pleasure, reducing pain, what comes to the same thing, right? So for him, there's no real difference between these two, right?
I was going to ask, like, okay, you were saying decrease pleasure or increase pain, I'm like, so would you do one and not do the other? If that makes any sense?
Uh-huh.
Could you decrease pleasure,
Uh-huh.
but not?
Well, you know, think of it like think of it like, say, taking an aspirin, right? You have a headache. You take an aspirin, your headache goes away, right? Has the aspirin actually given you what you would call pleasure? You feel better, right? It's decreased your pain, but, you know, it hasn't given you any kind of, like, you know, pleasant buzz or anything like that. Right? You know, aspirin doesn't work that way. But yeah, so I think, you know, you can, I think at least theoretically, do either of these independently of the other, right? The other thing that needs to be taken into account is, you know, the idea of the individual versus the group, right? Does what increases your pleasure actually increase pain or decrease pleasure for other people, right? So, for example, if, say, you know, Grace wanted to spend the whole class period marching up and down the aisles banging on cymbals, right? No. She might be having a great time, right? But that would increase pain for the rest of us, right? So by Bentham's calculus, that would be a wrong action. Even if it's right for her, it's wrong for the great mass of people, right? So Bentham is primarily concerned with what's good for the group. Now I want to try to dig into his essay a little bit before we move on to the Guin, which I want to spend a little more time on, in part because it's frankly more interesting. But there are some things I want to note about Bentham here first. So can I get a volunteer to read the first paragraph on page 464 for us?
I will.
Yeah, thank you.
Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong; on the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, and all we say, and all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In words, a man may pretend to observe their empire, but in reality he remains subject to it all the while. The principle of utility recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and of law. Systems which attempt to question it deal in sounds instead of sense, and caprice, okay?
Yep.
Instead of reason, and darkness instead of light.
Okay, thank you. So do you notice a strand running through this paragraph and the way he talks about pleasure and pain?
Yes, causes and then effects, darkness and light, stuff like that.
Okay. Yeah, he ends this with the set of binaries, right? But are there is there a particular type of word or words that relate to a particular thing that he often also relates to pleasure and pain? Let's look at his very first sentence. What does he call pleasure and pain in the first sentence?
Sovereign master.
Our sovereign masters, right? What's a sovereign?
That's separate from.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, we take like a sovereign nation. We were as self-ruling, right? So, for example, Native American nations within the boundaries of the United States are often themselves sovereign nations with their own government, at least some limited form of independence, right? That's not quite what Bentham means here by sovereign. If we talk about a sovereign, what are we talking about? Might help if we break the word down. What's at the end of the word? Reign.
So a single reigning person.
One dictator, master.
Pardon?
Is that a single ruler?
Yeah, exactly. And when we talk about a sovereign, we're usually talking about a single hereditary absolute monarch, right? A king or a queen, for example. So we'll try to tease out the implications of this in a minute, but just go through the rest of the paragraph and see if you can find similar words to this that he relates to pleasure and pain.
Thinking about how you just were talking about the monarch and stuff like that.
Uh-huh.
Throne.
Good,
empire,
yes.
Subjection.
Throne, subject, subjection, yep.
Whenever they say, he's repetitive in this sentence, they govern all we do, all we say.
Uh-huh.
He keeps saying, in all we, he repeats that a couple
Yeah,
times.
and yeah, we're talking, and I think, yeah, that's connected less to the ruler thing and more to the absolute thing, right?
Yeah.
All. So what does this suggest about the power pleasure and pain have over us?
They're pretty high up there.
Yeah. There's nothing we can do to resist it, right? He tells us that even if we think we're resisting it, we're actually just following those dictates, right? So pleasure and pain are set up here like despotic kings, right? That rule everything that we do. So that's the central metaphor here, right? These are absolute monarchs who control our every impulse. Now there's another metaphor near the end of this that, maybe like the language is a little funky, so maybe you didn't quite get it. But I want to spend a minute on this too because I think it's important to understand what's going on here. He says, the object of the principle of utility is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and law. Now, without necessarily understanding, say, what felicity is just yet, right? If you're making fabric with your hands, right, using your hands to make a fabric, what do we call that process?
Making fabric by hand.
What's that?
The seamstress, like weave.
Well, a seamstress doesn't actually make the fabric, right? A seamstress is taking actually existing pieces of it.
Okay.
What's that?
Fabric. No, I was thinking of like already having the fabric.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah.
Making the fabric. I have no idea. I know what that's called.
Okay, so you put a bunch of threads on a loom.
Oh,
Threader.
You're on the right track. The metaphor here is weaving. He's arguing that making laws to increase human happiness should be like weaving, right? That reason and law are the hands that weave the different threads together that create human happiness, right? And so the reason this is important is that Bentham is very much focused on this idea of unity, right? And on making a whole out of disparate parts. We get a similar situation if we look at the paragraph on the bottom of page 464. Can I get somebody to read that for us, paragraph 4 there, starting with the interest of the community?
I can read it.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel.
The interest of the community is one of the most general expressions that can occur in the phraseology of morals. No wonder that the meaning of it is often lost. Where it has a meaning, it has this. The community is a fictitious body composed of the individual persons who are considered as
Constituting, as it were.
Okay. As it were, its members. The interest of the community, then, is what the sum of the interests of several members who compose it.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a similar metaphor here, right? Or what does he compare the community to?
A fictitious body.
Yes, to a body, right? And what is a body made up of?
parts.
Parts, yes, specifically, as he puts it, members, right? And what he means by members is essentially like parts of a system, right? And the members are individuals. And so, the interest of the community then is what? The sum of the interests of the several members who compose it, right? So the interest of the community is what's best for everybody, right? What's best for the whole group. And what's best for everybody is what's best for society. And that is what should dictate for Bentham policymaking, right? Now, this all sounds pretty simple, right? But when we put this into actual policy-making situations, this becomes more complicated, in part because with almost any law that you make, there's going to be a loser, right? So, for example, does anybody know like why, say, environmentalists and unions, right, labor unions, both typically associated with the Democratic Party, tend to disagree with each other on a lot of policy. If I pass a law preserving, say, a spotted owl habitat in a forest, what becomes of the loggers whose job it is to cut those trees?
They'll be out of a job because they need, they need like the trees for the owls.
Yeah, and then, like, unless I come up with some other kind of provision to balance that out, right, and give them something else, then the law favors one group and not another, right? Now, the group that loses out might be small, right? The point I'm trying to make is that it's not possible in most cases to make everybody happy, right? So even if you're trying to make the largest number of possible people happy, right, you are always going to have a certain number of malcontents. Now, Guin is coming at this from a slightly different angle than the one that I've just used. And she's using many of Bentham's own ideas and taking them to their logical extremes in order to try to make a point about utilitarianism as a moral system. So let's turn to the ones who walk away from Omelas. And before I get started on this, did you guys have any particular thoughts about this?
Well, when I first started reading it, I was like, damn, I want to go to Omelas. And then I finished it, and I was like on the verge of tears.
Yeah.
I'd never want to go there.
Yeah, I mean, the story kind of puts you in a horrible moral position, right?
So I actually do have a question there.
Yeah.
So that is like, this, what she wrote, is like all true? Or was it?
Oh, it's fiction. It's just a story.
Okay,
yeah.
okay, good. I was like,
No,
I'm
it's-
pretty sure it's fiction, but
Yeah.
maybe all of it's true and I'm just missing.
I mean, she used the name of a real place as the basis
Okay.
for Omelas, right? It's Salem, Oregon.
Right.
But the only similarity between Omelas and Salem, Oregon is the name, right?
Right.
It's just because she saw Salem O in her rearview mirror as she was driving away from Salem, Oregon one day. And it was like, oh, that would be a good name for a kind of fantasy city, right? But yeah, no, I mean, it does put us in a really difficult moral position, right? Because life in Omelas seems really great and fun and beautiful, right? And the people seem really appealing. And then all of it is built on this horrible, horrible thing, right? And if you do away with this horrible thing, the whole social compact breaks down, right? Yeah, go ahead.
I think the ending kind of confused me because it talked about how like the children would be sad and stuff,
Uh-huh.
and then whenever the adults are sad, they also walked away too.
Yeah.
And it kind of, I don't know, I have a really dark mind, so it kind of made me think of like suicide, how they walked away from that life that's supposed to be happy because
Okay.
they didn't feel happy.
Well, and I think there's another way to think of the whole walking away thing, right? And I think we might want to compare the response of those who walk, like, how are those who eventually walk away similar to those who eventually decide to stay and come to terms with what's happening in Omelas? What does neither ever try to do?
Fix it.
Yeah, neither group actually tries to save the child,
Take
right?
the easy way out.
Yeah, well, and I don't think that the leaving is necessary. I think that maybe just sticking around and letting things get, that's the easy way out, right? I think that the walking away part is actually morally difficult. Because essentially, like, why do they walk away rather than trying to save the child or fix the problem?
Because they can't stand to be a part of society now.
Mm-hmm.
And not indulges in that, but like
Yeah.
just accepts that.
Yeah. So that's the impetus for the walking away, right?
Right. I don't know
But
why they don't help the child. I mean,
Mm-hmm. Well, what do they all think would happen
They
if
get
the
in
child is
trouble.
helped.
No one would be happy then and stuff.
Or they
Yeah.
get in trouble or something.
The whole society then breaks down, right? They
So-
destroy the perfect happiness of Omelas.
So instead of doing it for everybody, they just walk away.
Yes. That's exactly what.
And it seems like a cop-out story.
Because like in a way,
Yeah.
they're like helping the society by keeping it happy and all,
Mhm.
but there's still a child suffering because.
Yeah.
And like that's like really messed up to me. How you let one child suffer just so everybody will be happy.
Mhm. But then, that also raises the question, it's like, right, what right do I have to take away someone else's happiness, right? Because it's not just me that gets affected if I make this major change to society, right? All of my friends, neighbors, relatives, right, everybody I care about also gets affected. If I just walk away, if I just leave, then that only affects me, right? I can make the choice not to participate.
It sounds like an internal battle too, like
Yeah.
like man against, what is it, like man against versus self.
Yeah, I kept thinking man versus food, but I know that wasn't where you were going. Maybe it's just like, I get really hungry when I'm teaching, and maybe that's just... But, no, yeah, I think, I think there is it does depict a kind of internal battle that all of these people go through, right? And essentially, there are two results, and most people just decide, what are you going to do?
It
right?
is what it is.
Yeah. Go ahead, Grace.
So when I was reading, like towards the end, when it like just threw all of that
Uh-huh.
child stuff at us.
Yeah.
So not like the child, like in terms of like, I know this is like a fictional story, but
Yeah.
the child being there isn't actually like literally doing, like, is it like literally making their lives better that he's, or is it just like symbolic of like this child is like someone has to go through all of it in order for everyone to be happy?
I think it's probably more the. I think like within. I mean, remember this is basically fantasy, right? Really, like even more than it being simply fantasy, it's a thought experiment. Whether or not the prosperity of Omelas is actually built on the suffering of this individual child is probably immaterial.
Right.
The fact is that everyone believes that it is. I think that's what's more important here, is that everybody shares the belief that if this child is not suffering, then everything in Omelas goes to shit, right? And there's a lot that could go to shit here, right? I mean, it's, what's that?
What if the child dies? What are they
Mhm.
going to do?
Well, presumably they all do eventually, and they choose a different one, right? I mean, if we look, for example, page 483, we have the description of the child in that long paragraph there, right? The people at the door never say anything, but the child, who has not always lived in the tool room and can remember sunlight and its mother's voice, sometimes speaks. I will be good, it says. Please let me out. I will be good. Why is it important that the child remembers sunlight and its mother's voice and knows that things are better outside?
It could symbol like the hope, like trying to keep the happy memories and like your mom's voice and sunshine.
Yeah.
Just hoping one day he'll be able to get out and see his mother and see the sunshine instead of being trapped in the basement.
And if you keep hoping for these things and they never come true, what does that do to you?
Feeds you.
It increases your suffering, right? If you don't know that there's anything different, but you're put in
You just
conditions
think
like
that's
this.
how it is.
Yeah.
And you're
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, life sucks.
Exactly. The point is that the child has to suffer, right? The child has to suffer for all of this to work. And I think those particular lines about the child remembering sunlight in its mother's voice, right? Those are particularly wrenching, right? That this is, but that's that is the idea, right? We're supposed to have that same reaction that the citizens of Omelas do when they first learn about the child, right? But then, as people grow up and youthful idealism falls away, right, we tend to accept the compromises, the moral compromises that we make every day as members of a society, right? To give you, a good sort of contemporary example, right? Where do people do most of their shopping these days, especially since the pandemic hit? Online, right? Specifically where?
Amazon.
Yeah. Now, most of us are by now aware, right, that Amazon warehouses or jobs in warehouses arguably overwork employees, right? Provide relatively lousy pay and benefits, and often ask people to work under unsafe conditions.
Did not know that, but good to know.
On top of that, have you ever received a package from Amazon in which you have maybe say one little vegetable peeler in a box about this big, plus a bunch of those inflatable things so that it doesn't move around? So so the packaging is also environmentally wasteful, right? And because they ship everything all over the country using trucks and planes and helicopters, right?
And drones now.
And drones now, yeah, they produce a lot of carbon pollution, right? Not to mention the amount of carbon pollution that is produced by keeping the servers that they need to operate running, right? So this is all publicly available information, right? But Amazon keeps growing anyway, right? Because many of us kind of make that moral accommodation. It's well, I know about all this shitty thing that this company, all these shitty things this company does, but I need this thing, and I can't buy it anywhere locally, right? Or, I need this thing and there's no place else I can get it. Or, in some cases, it's just, too convenient to do otherwise. So I'm not trying to make some kind of moral point about people shopping on Amazon here. Seriously, I'm not trying to tell people not to do that, right? I personally don't, but my wife still does. The point I'm trying to make here, though, is that we are often kind of powerless individually to change these kinds of broader systems, and they ask us to do things that maybe we wouldn't agree to if we were looking clearly at the problem, right? And I think these individuals who are choosing to leave Omelas are like the guy who won't shop on Amazon anymore, right? I can't do anything to change these bigger systems, right? I can't change Amazon's business model or their environmental practices or whatever, right? All I can do is choose to spend my dollars elsewhere. But that leaves these bigger systems intact, right? And I think that's one of the central problems here, right? One of the central problems that the story identifies is that unless you can get the people who stay in Omelas to agree that their happiness is built on an injustice, everything's just going to continue as it is, right? Everything's going to continue as it was. Now, I do want to look at the beginning of the story because I think, like, even in that kind of perfect picture we get of our first glimpse of Amalus, I think there are some hints of things that are maybe a little bit suspect, like once we've read the whole story and can look back. So can I get somebody to start reading from With a Clamor of Bells? And I just want you to think about as we're reading through this, right? What things about Amalus really strike you? Like, what really stands out to you?
With the clamor of bells that set the swallows soaring, the festival of summer came to the city of Amalus, bright towered by the sea. The rigging of the boats in harbor sparkled with flags. In the streets between houses with red roofs and painted walls, between old moss-grown gardens and under avenues of trees, past great parks and public buildings, processions moved. Some were decorous, old people in long stiff robes of mauve and gray, grave master workmen, quiet, merry women carrying their babies and chatting as they walked. In other streets the music beat faster, a shimmering of gong and tambourine, and the people went dancing. The procession was a dance. Children dodged in and out, their high claws rising like the swallows, crossing flights over the music and singing. All the processions moved towards the north side of the city, where on the great water meadow called the green fields, boys and girls, naked in the bright air, with mud-stained feet and ankles, and long lithe arms, and exercised their restive horses before the race. The horses wore no gear at all but a halter without bed. Their manes were braided with streamers of silver, gold, and green. They flared their nostrils and pranced and boasted to one another. They were vastly excited, the horse being the only animal who has adopted our ceremonies as his own. For off to the north and west the mountains stood up, half encircling Amalus on her bed. The air of morning was so clear that the snow still crowning in the 18 peaks burned with the white gold of fire across the miles of sunlit air, under the dark blue of the sky. There was just enough wind to make the banners that marked the race course snap and flutter now and then. In the silence of the broad green meadows, one could hear the music winding through the city streets, farther and nearer and ever approaching, a cheerful faint sweetness of the air that from time to time trembled and gathered together and broke out into the great joyous clanging of the bells.
Okay, so first thing to note here, what opens and closes the paragraph? What do we have at the beginning and the end?
The bells.
The bells, good. So what do bells signify? Clanging of bells.
I think of Christmas, but
Yeah.
it's not the season.
Sure. Well, yeah. This is the festival of summer, right? So Christmas is, it's a holiday. It's a celebration, right?
Like Christmas in July.
Well, I mean, maybe you don't hear the bells ringing then, right?
Okay.
Yeah. But I think just more generally, if we think about like a holiday, right? We think about bells clanging.
Bells for like New Year's Eve and stuff.
Yeah.
If this is the festival of summer,
Uh-huh.
why is there snow?
Well, there's snow on the mountains, right?
What?
You would think. But I think that is part of the whole experience. Remember, this is a fictional city, right? Everything here is ideal. So you have all kinds of different, like any experience you want, right? Everything's good. You want to go up in the mountains and go skiing, there's lots of snow, right? You want to hang out in the green fields and watch the horse races, you can do that too, right? Because it is summer. But getting back to the whole bells thing, right? So yeah, we do associate bells with holidays and with celebration, right? They ring the bells at a wedding, that sort of thing, right? What else do we associate with the clanging of bells that is maybe not quite so pleasant?
Loud.
Okay, they're loud, they are. If bells started clanging in this building right now, what would that probably mean?
Fire.
Yeah. Bells are also used as emergency alarms, right? Yeah, warning, alarm, yes. Good. So I want to focus on the nature aspect of here for a second too, because Ryland brought that up, right, with the snow in the summer. Right? There is another thing that I want to point out about Amalus here. If we look at that far to the north and west, the mountains stood up half encircling Amalus on her bay. If we look at how Amalus is kind of geographically situated between the mountains and the bay, what does that mean? What does that... What's the city's geographical situation like? We do have those different kinds of potentially pleasurable experiences, right? You know, there's the beach and the ocean, and the mountains right next to each other. But if the mountains stood up half encircling Amalus on her bay, right? There's the bay on one side, the mountains on the other. It's enclosed, right? It's encircled and protected.
Oh, so the mountains protect the people?
Yeah. Or you know,
So
you
it's like mountain around the whole thing, or
Around the one side and
And then the bay
bay's
on the other, yeah.
So it's just kind of, no one comes this way.
They're secluded in a way. Like
yeah, it's enclosed and secluded. Yeah. You know, magical land, and you can't get there.
So nobody knows that they're there.
Yeah, it's kind of like secret and protected, right? Anything else you guys notice of interest in this paragraph?
What about with the kids like running in the green fields and they're naked? Like, why are they naked?
But
They're just free.
yeah, just as the horses are wearing no gear except a halter without a bit, right? I think that the nudity is associated here with freedom. There doesn't seem to be anything sexual about it.
I didn't
It's just,
think it was
yeah,
anything
yeah,
sexual. I
but
was
it's-
just like,
No, and I'm just pointing out that I think it seems to be more about freedom here.
She used a lot of imagery to like really make us feel like, I don't know, when I was reading that, I was like, oh my god, this place is awesome.
Yeah, there's
Like, it seems so
Mhm.
like happy and like almost like too good to be true, and then at
Yeah,
the end you realize
it
like,
is.
shit, it is too good to be true.
It is too good to be true, yeah, and she's like a lot of real strong sensory imagery,
Like the
right?
sweetness of the air, like
Yeah.
when you go there.
Yeah, like you can. There are a lot of sound words. There are a lot of sight words, right? Even kind of smell and taste words.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to draw your attention for a minute to the processions. What do you note about the two different processions that are described? What's the first one look like? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's the dignified and slow one. And then there's the one that is more like a dance. Now, I want to pay attention to the language that the one that is described as a dance is discussed in terms of. Right? So, in other streets, the music beat faster, a shimmering of gong and tambourine, and the people went dancing. The procession was a dance. So, what instruments are the people playing as they're marching?
Tambourine and whatever it was, gong.
A tambourine and a gong, right? Yes. And how are tambourines and gongs alike? How do you play them?
use your hands.
Mm-hmm. To do what?
Make beat.
Yeah. You hit them, right?
Yeah.
They're played by hitting. And we're told that the music beat faster. Now, on the one hand, beat can refer to rhythm, right? What else can the word beat refer to?
Violence.
Yeah.
Like what they did to the little kid.
Yes, exactly, right? So we've got the bells at either end of the paragraph giving us a warning that things aren't really what they seem here, right? And then even in the joy that people are taking in the dance, right? They're hitting these instruments and they're beating, right? So,
Literally gave us all of it in the first paragraph.
Yeah.
And then you can-
yeah. Now, to be fair, the child isn't literally beaten
Right.
in the room, right? Occasionally,
He's kicked.
he or she is occasionally kicked, yeah. But most of the torture that he or she suffers is from neglect, right?
Could he maybe could the kid hear the sounds and like, get like worried, like?
Oh, probably, but it doesn't really tell us that, right?
Oh, okay.
When you read this for the first time, did you like see all of this when you were reading it, like the first paragraph, or did you do it after the fact? I'm just curious because I want to be able to at some point in my life, analyze things the way that you do on my own.
Well, and let me just say, well, first, when I first read this, I'd already been warned as to what was coming.
Oh. Okay.
So it didn't come as a shock to me. And secondly, in order to analyze text like this, really what it takes is experience and practice, right? It's I'm not any smarter than any of you, but I'm about twice your age and I've been doing this for most of my life. So, I may leap to certain conclusions faster. It might not always be clear exactly how I got there. So when it's not clear how I got there, please stop me. And I'm happy to try to outline for you what I'm thinking, right? But yeah, here what I'm doing is associating the word beat with the action of hitting, right? And associating that with the torment that props everything up in this city, right? The child may not get literally beaten, but...
We associate beating with abuse.
What's that?
I said we associate beating with abuse.
Yeah, it is abuse, yeah. The child is clearly abused. So one more thing I want to look at here before I let you guys go, and this largely has to do with context, right? I want to talk about this paragraph that follows the first one, right? So joyous, how is one to tell about joy? How describe the citizens of Omelas? They were not simple folk, you see, though they were happy. But we do not say the words of cheer much anymore. All smiles have become archaic. Given a description such as this, one tends to make certain assumptions. Given a description such as this, one tends to look next for the king, mounted on a splendid stallion and surrounded by his noble knights, or perhaps in a golden litter borne by great-muscled slaves. But there was no king. They did not use swords or keep slaves. They were not barbarians. So, what does she say we expect? What kind of story do we expect when we see a setup like this in that first paragraph?
A leader, someone that's wait, are you talking about?
Talking about in terms of genre. What kind of story does she think we expect?
Like a heroic, someone like a central hero or something, or a central leader.
Yeah. And what kinds of stories have heroes and kings and noble knights?
Fantasy.
Fairy tales. And with what stage of life do we tend to associate fairy tales? Childhood, yes. Good.
Now that you said that, it does seem like a fairy tale, like a bedtime story.
Yeah.
Because I wouldn't, like she said, I would never saw the hints to the kid, the kid.
Yeah.
In this first paragraph. Because it just seemed like a great description.
And the fact is, too, is I don't see these things on a first reading either, right? But most of these things you pick up as you read something multiple times, right? So this is much easier to notice with hindsight when we know how this ends, right? But so we're associating here childhood in the fairy tales with happiness and with innocence, right? Right? Adults don't understand happiness anymore. Adults get all sour and unpleasant and think that things that are happy must be dumb, right? Although I will say that the children understand happiness because they don't yet know how to be otherwise.
Yeah.
I will say that most of the annoying adults I know are also happy all the time because they don't understand how to be otherwise. That's an entirely different issue. So I'd like to take a look for a minute. We'll sort of finish on this with what she specifically excludes from their society as well, right? The things she says they don't. So she's already said they don't have kings or swords, things like that. But then they also don't have the stock exchange, the advertisement, the secret police,
and the bomb.
or the bomb. So let's try to think about what these things have in common and why she would exclude them from this society. Some of these might be easier to relate to each other than others.
Well, if there's no stock exchange, then why do you have that? You don't need to advertise it?
Okay, yeah, so if we're, the stock exchange and the advertisement both relate to capitalism, right?
Yeah.
So whatever monetary system we have here is not capitalist.
Right.
Right, good start.
They don't need a bomb because they're not going to war with anyone. They're not
Mhm.
in danger. They're not going against anyone. The police is not necessary because they're the secret police.
Uh-huh.
Because there's not violence.
Yeah, well, and I think the secret police and the bomb are dealing with that's all about historically specific issues here too, right? So I think this is what I'm going to try to get to as we close out here. So Guin writes this story in 1973. So in relation to the bomb, right, this is at the height of the Cold War. And the Vietnam War is also in full swing, right? So the United States and the Soviet Union are both nuclear-armed powers. They are the two great world superpowers, and they've got their missiles aimed at each other all the time, right? So whether there was a genuine threat of nuclear annihilation or not, people definitely felt that threat. And even, when I was a kid in the 80s, people were still feeling that threat, right? We weren't doing duck and cover drills anymore, but, it was still, this fear that, either Gorbachev or Reagan was going to push the button and it was going to end us all. We also have to remember in 1973 that within recent historical memory, nuclear bombs had been dropped on cities, right? Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? That was still there are still people alive who remember that, of course, right? But in 1973, those people weren't that old. So the idea of the bomb is much more kind of present and threatening in overall culture, right? And the idea of the secret police, I think, is important as well, because what this is demonstrating is that the society of Omelas is not authoritarian. Right? It's not capitalist, and it's not warlike, but it's also not authoritarian, right? The basic purpose of a secret police is essentially to go and find enemies of the regime, right, and make them go away. And this was something that we saw both in, officially leftist societies like, Eastern Bloc countries like East Germany had the Stasi and Russia had the KGB. But we also saw it in countries that were run by far-right governments. For example, in Chile, under the government of General Pinochet in the 70s, hundreds of people who were associated with the Chilean Communist Party just disappeared. Now, they reappeared in the late 80s when their bodies started washing up on the shore. But, secret police in countries across the world, across political ideologies in the mid-20th century, really were disappearing people, right? So the idea that this is a society without these various sources of status seeking and stress and terror, right, is one thing that makes Omelas seem so appealing, especially in 1973, for these very specific reasons, right? But then, would you, even given all this, allow that one thing on which the prosperity of Omelas is built, to go back to Dostoevsky, right? The unavenged tears of that child. And that's the basic question we're asked to consider here, right? And the question is supposed to be hard, right? It's supposed to make us feel like shit, really. Because it's not a question that has a good or easy answer. All right, so on that exceedingly depressing note, we're going to stop there. And so Thursday we'll talk about Frederick Douglass, and there'll be a little bit more uplift in that.
Are we gonna talk a little bit more about omelets, or we're done talking about that?
Officially we're done talking about that, but if you want to talk more about it next session, we can start there.